Hello there, my name's Ella and I'm head of the Red House.
My name's Chris and I'm the head of the archive and library at the Red House.
So welcome to the Red House. We are actually at the Britten and Pears archive, but we're here to talk about Benjamin Britten and Peter Pears' home that they share together. It's located in Aldborough, the seaside town on the edge of Suffolk, and they lived here between 1957 and 76 when Britten died, and Pears in 86. So it's a beautiful home. It's an old farmhouse that dates from the mid-17th century. But what we do primarily focus on is their time together in the house. There's lots of kind of ancillary buildings that hark back to its farmhouse roots. But out of it, they created a beautiful home, a really special home, a lived-in home, and we are here to really share that with as many people as possible.
So it's now run as a heritage house by Britten and Pears Arts, which is descended from the organisation that the two men set up in their lifetime. There's actually an awful lot more that Britten and Pears Arts does. The heritage house is only part of the activities. It also runs the Aldborough Festival, it runs the Snape Maltings Concert Hall 5 miles away, which the two men founded. It does a lot of community outreach with arts and music scattered around Suffolk and beyond, so music in prisons, outreach to local primary schools and so forth. And the Heritage House is strangely a rather late addition to that portfolio. For the first couple of decades, in particular after Pears' death, the house was used as a base by the charity. It was used to house musicians who were coming to perform at the festival. And it was used as the headquarters of the charity. And so unusually that means that there was never a clear out after the two men's death. The domestic items within the house were still there and they were still being used. And that profusion of surviving objects linked to people who lived fairly recently gives us the opportunity to do something slightly different with the house than a lot of heritage environments. We can present it almost as a sort of immersive experience where you get the chance to step back into Britten and Pears' lives.
So we do have to bear in mind Britten and Pears' wishes. They never really wanted the house to be turned into a museum, and that's what we kind of are now as an accredited museum and a heritage site. So it's a challenge, and it's just quite interesting how we then use that kind of information to present the house for visitors.
Yeah, and obviously we have to use it as a heritage environment in a sense because we are charged with carrying on their work within the community and inspiring people, and as memory of them fades, the way that you inspire people to do the sort of things that they were interested in is by starting out getting them interested in the story of the two men. So we feel comfortable in a sense sort of disregarding their instructions by running a museum here. And one of the other things that makes us comfortable with that is we have to think, what did they actually mean when they said that they didn't want the house to be a museum? And I think what they meant was a caricature, if you like, of what a museum would have been thought of back in the 50s, 60s, 70s as a static environment with everything kept under glass, labelled, pinned down and dead in a sense. And what we're aiming to do rather is present the house as a living environment. So we're presenting it as a heritage environment but not as what they thought of as a museum. And that, it becomes possible to do that because of the range of material that they've left us. But it also has its own challenges, as we're going to talk about today.
What we're really lucky is having the space to tell Britten and Pears' story in different ways. We've actually converted and created an exhibition gallery space, so we do have things behind glass doors. But for mainly the house, it's very much a case of you go in and there's very little interpretation, apart from perhaps a few things, and our volunteers who are our kind of interpretive tool. So it's very much, again, you're invited to go through the house like you would a friend or someone else, and you kind of move through the house as again, you would someone else's home. So what's really lovely with a home is that it's something that people kind of recognise and have themselves. So it's very much going into that world of that kind of homeliness, someone else's space, and just kind of respecting that and going through it as you go along.
So an awful lot really depends on that first interaction with the volunteer who's invigilating the entrance hall as you go into the house. The volunteer's job is to set out the basic ground rules or the ground assumptions of how the house operates, that there will be no labels, but there are invigilators in the rooms that you can ask questions of if you need to know, for example, what a particular painting is. That we ask you not to lean on the furniture or tread on some of the rugs, and we ask you to put on overshoes if it's raining. And obviously one of the challenges is making sure that that's a collaborative enterprise rather than simply barking orders at the visitor. I think the one bit of labelled content that we have within the house sits in that entrance hall as well, and the volunteer might well tell the story of that. There's a portrait of Britten and Pears called Double Concerto that was painted in 1968, just after the Sexual Offences Act had made their relationship legal for the first time. It's a picture of the two men sitting on a bench outside Snape Maltings, rather as we are sitting now, actually. And in the initial version, Pears's arm was draped along the back of the bench, his fingertips just touching Britten's shoulder. And Britten was incredibly uncomfortable with that. This was the sort of display of open affection that he'd spent decades training himself not to do, because through the long years that their life together was illegal. And so the artist painted out that arm, and on the version that we have in the entrance hall you can see a reed bed instead, with the really obvious ghost of Pears's yellow sweater underneath it. So that is their relationship and their years together in a nutshell, in a sense, the years of concealment, but also the fact that now we're able to put that front and centre in the visitor experience in a way that would have been science fiction when the two men were alive. So that's one of the ways in which people are, I suppose, primed as they enter the house. They see that, they hear the story from the volunteer, and they're primed to experience the house from that point onwards. There are other bits of priming as well that take place. There are whole layers of the interaction and layers of the amount of information that people may get or not as they go into the house, and I think we'll run through some of them now.
So the visiting experience has multiple layers, and some of them really start before they even arrive here. It's the information that we provide on our website and in print. But when they land here and they've arrived, it's very much kind of it's the interactions, the human interactions with our welcome team, with our volunteers. It's the information that we offer them as well. We have a visitor map, we have a guidebook, but it's very for us in our mind really it's the volunteers and the interaction they have, because they monitor the library and the house. So they are the first kind of tool that really they can really kind of enliven Britten and Pears' story and the space that they're in. We provide a lot of information, metadata about the collection, the art that we provide to the volunteers. So again, they're a really big kind of source of information. But then it's also things that we can't really control. It's people kind of going through spaces and recognising things that that they may have, like a book on a shelf, or the cork on the walls that it seems to be very, very popular with some of the visitors.
Yeah. And what you actually see as you walk through the house is going to vary. Some people simply want to walk through the house with minimal interaction with the volunteers, simply getting their own impression. Others will talk more to the volunteers. They will get perhaps different anecdotes according to which volunteer is there. There's a lot of stuff within the house that you don't actually see unless a volunteer opens a cupboard door, because the house is jam-packed with stuff that hasn't actually been put on display. It's still very much a living home. There are all sorts of other layers of information that are potentially available. If you come down here to the archive, for example, we do talks on things from the archive collection, which will often flesh out the life that was lived there. There are articles on the website telling those stories in more detail. There's the archive catalogue if you want to browse through it, and the catalogue of the artworks and the books within the collection. So there's a vast amount of information available to the visitor that will, to an extent, possibly dictate, but certainly inform what their reaction is, and it's not 100% possible for us to control how much of that information they choose to avail themselves of, either before, during, or after their visit.
And just to add to that, really, there are still plenty of moments where they don't have those interactions, that they can actually walk through corridors on their own, admire what they see in front of them. We have 5 acres of garden as well, so again, there's a lot of that space where they can kind of take in and enjoy. And again, going back to those intangibles, it's the atmosphere of the site. It's often, people say that it's very peaceful, it's very quiet, and a real sanctuary. So again, you can't. That's so hard to really identify what that means. But it's very much kind of the environment that we're surrounded by.
Yeah, creating space for contemplation, I think, is part of the whole Red House experience. Whilst at the same time, we want to get information across to the visitor. And I think it's probably appropriate at this point, I suppose, for us to summarise the different spaces that people go into. We've talked a lot about the Red House, which is self-guided to a large extent, movement through rooms invigilated by volunteers, with the amount of interaction with those volunteers that you choose as a visitor to have. There's Britten's Composition Studio, which is a sort of halfway house between what the Red House offers and a more orthodox heritage space. It's laid out very much as it was when Britten worked there, but unlike the Red House, it's not invigilated, and so there is a rope that separates you from going into the depths of the studio. At the end where visitors stand, there is a more orthodox setup with display boards and buttons that you can press playing bits of music. So to an extent, that feels like a more orthodox heritage space, but also you're there unsupervised, you're on your own, and it is quite often an emotional experience for the visitor being in the place where the magic happened, as it were. And then we also have Britten and Pears' library, which is a heritage space that is invigilated, and then, but off that, the exhibition gallery, which is more a matter of explanatory text, cases, and so forth. So the visitor is moving in and out of those different spaces, and the idea is that when they come into one of the uninvigilated spaces, or one of the spaces where they're left to silent contemplation, they have the information to hand that enables them to make sense of it, and hopefully to get across the atmosphere that we feel is appropriate to that place.
Britten and Pears, obviously known for their music, performing together, Britten writing music for them and other works. And it's often kind of commented that actually when they go through the house, they don't hear any music. There's no piped music in the house. And we did that deliberately because obviously they would never play music in the way that, they would never really have a radio in the background. It was very much a career and a vocation.
I'm reminded there actually that in 1971, I think it is, Michael Tippett, their fellow composer, put together a list of recipes from musicians and composers. Each composer provided a recipe and a meal into which you would slot that, a menu. And among the questions they were asked is what music would accompany this meal. And it's notable that the composers in there, to a man, and I have to say it is mostly male, to a man answer the question what music would accompany this meal with none. Or in Britten and Pears' case, none of course. Because music is something that you give your full attention to. It's not background noise. And that very much is part of the Red House experience, that they did not have a radio burbling on in the background because they wanted to give full attention to things. So the Red House is silent. We have music potentially within this composition studio, as we were saying earlier. The library, interestingly, is full of books. It has the look of a silent study space, and quite often simply stepping into it silences visitors' conversations. But actually it was designed as a space where you could rehearse. There's a piano there, there's room for a string quartet as well. And that was always a noisy space, a place where there would be conviviality and conversation and music being played. So one of our challenges is how do we get that across, really, when everything about the visuals of the place seems to say silence, shush, people are studying here. I think that's the sort of the range of different spaces. That question of the music and where is the music, I think leads us to the cultural preparedness of the visitor, doesn't it? The fact that we're dealing with musicians, and yet we can't necessarily count on people coming with a knowledge of it. Contrast, for example, I suppose if you're running the Bronte household, everybody knows what Wuthering Heights is, even if you've not read the book, you've seen the film or you've heard Kate Bush. That there's a cultural preparedness which we can't count on with Britten and Pears' music, and so we have to get around that in other ways.
So there are musical elements for the visitors to kind of take up and engage with. Mainly the composition studio where Britten worked, there are extracts of works that he composed that you can hear, but also you can actually hear him talk about the space, which I think is quite special. The gallery, it has an accompanying audio guide, and again there's lots of opportunities to kind of hear music, again hear the Britten and Pears talking, video clips, that kind of thing. But also we don't limit music to that experience. We have concerts in the library as well, and again it's that using how that space was used, and using it kind of and repurposing it for people to really get that experience in.
Yeah. Obviously, a lot of our visitors may well come with a lot of foreknowledge of Britten and Pears. And for some, it's a place of pilgrimage, and if they're musicians, for example, who are performing at Snape, then they know the repertoire far better than we do quite often, and so there is that sense of almost entering the Holy of Holies. But we can't count on that. And the thing about music is it takes time. You can't ask people to sit down and listen to an entire opera to get the feel for what Britten was doing in 1954, for example. Excerpts will only go so far. So we know that we're dealing with some people coming and interacting with this space with a full knowledge of Britten and Pears' musical output. But for others, we've got to start from scratch, really. We have to assume that they know these people are important in some way or interesting in some way. How do we get across that sense of what went on in this house? And I think that the key thing there is the personal relationship, isn't it? I think everyone can relate to that.
Definitely. And actually, there are other entry points as well as their relationship. And being a queer space, I think it's something we're really proud of and we really want to kind of champion and share. But you don't have to be a musician to really appreciate the site here. We have they amassed an incredible art collection. Yeah. So that often is something that people really draw on. We've also got a beautiful garden as well, and there's visitors that just are interested in gardens only, and so I feel like we really do try and kind of capture that. And again, it just gives you different kind of appreciation of how they were, how they lived, and just more appreciation, and hopefully it sparks kind of an interest in who they were and what their music was like and how they lived their lives.
Yeah. And it's a documentation of their lives in a very rounded sense. You know, you get to know them almost as people. I'm reminded of a tweet that one of our visitors sent out earlier on this year, actually, going around the house staring at their bookshelves, which is something a lot of people do, because of course you look at somebody's bookshelves and it's a map of the inside of their head. He was fascinated by the bookshelves and the domestic items on view, and tweeted that basically it was like visiting your grandparents' house if your grandparents had both been male and brilliant musicians. So there's that sense of these are both cultural figures of some heft and moment. They link into the world of high culture, but also I'm stepping into their shoes and I can see what it was like to make a home here. And if I want to, I can focus on the fact that it's a gay home at a time when it was illegal, but I can also just focus on the cosy domesticity of it. There's that whole range of responses available to the visitor.
So I feel we're able to touch on quite a few senses as you go through. Obviously what you see, what you can touch or kind of go through and tread through. But there's also the sensory kind of experience. Chris mentioned the fact that it felt like going through someone's grandparents' home. And for me, that really felt like that. You know, it's the smell and the way that the house kind of feels as you go through and interact. I mean, books in a bookshelf smell like, and it's the fabric. And I feel that that's probably, that's intentional in some ways to what we do. Conserving for us is very kind of light touch housekeeping. So we're not really there stripping and bleaching the walls. I hope we'll never have to do that.
Stop me if I ever try.
Yes, exactly. But it's really kind of getting, it's the how the house absorbs kind of moisture, and then how the furniture and the fabrics kind of interact with that, and it really gives you a sense of a period of time and the past.
So summing up, I suppose what we're trying to do is preserve the intangible feel of the house and of the men who lived there, and the intangible relationship between them. And we're trying to do that by creating the reaction between the house that we can control and the objects in it that we know about, and the visitor who comes to us with preconceptions and amounts of knowledge or not that we cannot control and can't predict. We're trying to make the interaction of visitor and stuff produce something intangible, that sense of I know what this place was like, I know what these men were like. So we're trying to do that on the fly, changing from year to year, because of course as you go on, the house in a sense changes in that it gets further and further into the past. The Britten and Pears are not in living memory any longer. We know what we do now is not going to be the same that we or our successors are doing in 20 years' time, because the number of people who know Britten and Pears visiting here will have diminished down to virtually nothing. It's a constant matter of trying to produce that intangible frisson, I suppose, that sense that I'm in contact with this place and I'm picking up on the atmosphere. Preserving atmosphere, that's what we're about, really. Perhaps the most difficult task that you can set yourself in the heritage environment.
Absolutely. But I think also we're encouraged by the past as well. We know that Peter Pears loved to decorate the house, obviously collected and expanded his art collection and book collection as they went along. So we know that we can use kind of creative license to reset rooms, move paintings around, because we know that that's what they did. And so then for me that feels like that's a way of us keeping that site and the house alive, by just kind of being mobile with it, not completely changing functions of rooms, for example, but actually just knowing that we have such a rich collection that we can't always show every year. So we just try and kind of move things around and just giving that sense of a life that's developing, lived in, and changing.
Yeah, and thinking about their original strictures about it not being a museum. There's actually nothing truer to life than the fact that the artworks move around. Britten always used to complain that he'd come home and find that a painting that he expected to be in the living room was suddenly on the upstairs landing. And I like to think that if they could come back and see it, they'd see things moving around and say, oh, okay, that's fine. It's not preserved in aspic. Yeah. It's not a museum as we understood it. It's a living house, and that's what we wanted.